In the shadows of 1950s, Hollywood, a filmmaker dared to create what many consider the first film exploring gender identity in American cinema. But behind this bizarre cult classic lay a true story so groundbreaking that it shook American society to its core. A pioneer emerged in an era when conformity ruled with an iron fist, challenging every notion of identity that post-war America held sacred. This is the untold story of how a life-changing procedure in Denmark sparked a media storm that eventually inspired one of the most misunderstood films in Hollywood history. The year was 1953. While most Americans were focused on the Korean War and the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, director Ed Wood was quietly crafting a film that would become both notorious and revolutionary. Glen or Glenda wasn't just another B-movie. It was a deeply personal project inspired by real events that had captivated the nation just months earlier. Yet, the connection between the film and its real-life inspiration remained hidden from public view for decades. What most viewers didn't realize was that behind Wood's strange, dreamlike film lay the incredible true story of Christine Jorgensen, America's first widely known woman to undergo a public transformation of identity. Her journey from an ex-soldier named George to Christine dominated headlines and eventually inspired Wood's controversial film. But the relationship between Jorgensen's groundbreaking story and Wood's cinematic response was far more complex than anyone realized at the time. As we uncover this forgotten chapter of LGBTQ+ history, we'll discover how two unlikely pioneers, one a celebrated media sensation, the other a struggling filmmaker, both helped spark the earliest mainstream conversations about identity in America. And what happened next would forever change how such stories were portrayed in cinema. On December 1st, 1952, the New York Daily News ran a headline that would stop America in its tracks. GI becomes blonde beauty. The story of Christine Jorgensen exploded across American consciousness like a cultural bombshell. Overnight, a previously unknown 26-year-old from the Bronx became one of the most talked about figures in the world. Jorgensen had undergone a transformative procedure in Copenhagen, Denmark, one of the few places at the time offering such pioneering medical work. Upon her return to the United States, she was met by a media frenzy unlike anything seen before for a private citizen. Reporters crowded the airport, photographers jostled for position, and Jorgensen stepped into the flashbulbs wearing an elegant fur coat and hat, poised and confident despite the chaos. The American public was simultaneously fascinated and unsettled. Here was someone who had served in the military during World War II, a symbol of traditional masculinity, who had transformed into what newspapers called a striking blonde woman. The contrast was irresistible to editors hungry for copy. Jorgensen's story dominated headlines for months as journalists dissected every detail of her transformation and re-entry into American society. What made her story especially powerful was her poise under pressure. Unlike earlier cases treated as sideshow curiosities, Jorgensen was articulate, graceful, and self-possessed. She refused to be reduced to spectacle. Instead, she used her platform to begin a national conversation about authenticity, something the public had never confronted in such a visible form. As Jorgensen became a household name, one filmmaker in particular took notice. Ed Wood, then fighting to find recognition in Hollywood, saw in her story not just a headline, but a mirror of his own private world. And from that realization, one of the strangest films in American cinema began to take shape. Before diving into Glen or Glenda, we need to understand its creator. Edward D. Wood Jr. wasn't just any filmmaker. He was a complex dreamer whose life experiences would profoundly shape his most personal work. Born in 1924 in Poughkeepsie, New York, Wood had been drawn to storytelling from childhood. But there was another side to him that few understood. According to friends and later biographers, Wood's mother sometimes dressed him in girls' clothing when he was young, an experience that left a lasting imprint. As an adult, he found comfort in occasionally wearing women's clothing, particularly soft Angora sweaters, which would later become a recurring symbol in his films. When Wood arrived in Hollywood in the late 1940s, he was determined to succeed, but found himself working on the margins of the industry. With tiny budgets and untrained actors, he earned a reputation for creating films that were technically clumsy, but emotionally sincere. Critics mocked his work, missing the vulnerability behind it. When Christine Jorgensen's story broke in 1952, producer George Weiss saw profit potential. He approached Wood to make a quick, sensationalized picture inspired by the real-life headlines. But what Weiss envisioned as a simple exploitation movie became something deeply personal in Wood's hands, a chance to explore his own understanding of self. In an intense burst of creativity, Wood wrote Glen or Glenda in only 3 days. While the producer wanted shock value, Wood sought meaning. What resulted would become one of the most misunderstood yet pioneering films of its time. To understand the full story, we have to look closer at Christine Jorgensen's remarkable life. Born George William Jorgensen Jr. in 1926, she grew up in the Bronx during the Great Depression. From an early age, she felt a deep disconnect between how others saw her and how she saw herself, an experience that had no language or recognition in pre-war America. After serving in the military during World War II, Jorgensen learned about medical advancements in Europe that addressed identity alignment. Determined to find peace, she saved her money and traveled to Copenhagen in 1950, where she met Dr. Christian Hamburger, a specialist in hormone therapy. What began as treatment eventually led to a series of procedures that aligned her outer appearance with her inner identity. What made Jorgensen's case extraordinary wasn't only the science, it was her grace. In a letter to her parents later published in the press, she wrote, "Nature made a mistake which I have corrected, and now I am your daughter." That sentence, simple yet profound, struck a chord with millions who had never considered that identity could transcend biology. When she returned to the United States, Jorgensen didn't retreat from attention. She faced it. She became a stage performer, actress, and public speaker, using entertainment as a bridge to understanding. Her shows mixed humor and storytelling, inviting audiences to see her not as a curiosity, but as a person. Even as the press crossed boundaries and some coverage turned invasive, she remained calm, composed, and endlessly patient. Her dignity reshaped how the public perceived her story. When she was later denied a marriage license because her birth certificate still listed her as male, it made front-page news and forced Americans to confront the meaning of identity itself. At the same time, in Hollywood, Ed Wood was paying close attention, fascinated, moved, and inspired by the way her story echoed his own questions about self-expression. When Glen or Glenda premiered in 1953, audiences were bewildered. Marketed as an educational feature about identity and expression, what they saw defied all expectations. It was part documentary, part surreal dream, and part confession. The story centers on Glen, a man wrestling with his need to express himself through women's clothing, a secret he hides from his fiancée. Intercut with this narrative are quasi-documentary explanations of identity and expression, and surreal dream sequences narrated by Bela Lugosi as a mysterious figure offering cryptic observations on human nature. What made the film truly remarkable was its empathy. At a time when most depictions of gender nonconformity were mocking or hostile, Glen or Glenda treated its subject with compassion. It drew a clear distinction between those exploring gender expression and those seeking medical transformation, urging viewers to approach both with understanding rather than fear. Wood even cast himself in the title role under the pseudonym Daniel Davis. When Glen transforms into Glenda, the relief and serenity that cross his face feel unmistakably genuine. The camera lingers on these moments with quiet intimacy, revealing more truth than most audiences were prepared to see. The film also includes a secondary storyline about an individual born with both male and female characteristics who chooses to live as a woman, a clear nod to Jorgensen's experience. However, that subplot is less developed than the central story, suggesting that Wood's real focus was on his own experiences of identity and self-expression. Critics at the time were merciless. They called the film incoherent, amateurish, and absurd. It flopped commercially. Yet, in hindsight, Glen or Glenda was one of the first American films to speak about identity with sympathy instead of ridicule, a remarkable achievement for 1953. The making of Glen or Glenda was as unconventional as the film itself. With almost no money, Wood gathered his cast and crew for a whirlwind 4-day shoot. Every frame was born from improvisation, resourcefulness, and determination. One of the strangest and most memorable elements was the participation of Bela Lugosi. The former Dracula star's career had fallen on hard times, and Wood, an admirer, reached out to him. Lugosi's scenes, filmed in a single day, show him as an enigmatic narrator musing about life's mysteries and hidden desires. The dialogue is cryptic, almost poetic, adding a haunting layer to the film's dream logic. Dolores Fuller, Wood's girlfriend at the time, played Glen's fiancée Barbara. Years later, she revealed she hadn't realized how personal the story was for Wood until filming began. Seeing him wearing her Angora sweater for a scene came as a surprise, one that mirrored the very themes the movie explored. The filming process was anything but ordinary. Because the budget barely covered film stock, scenes were often done in one take. Lighting rigs failed, props broke, and sets were rearranged between shots to serve double duty. Yet, this chaos gave the movie a strange immediacy, a rawness that polished Hollywood productions rarely achieved. Some of the dream sequences feature imagery of restraint and struggle, symbolic visualizations of the pressure to hide one's true self. These moments, though technically rough, were Wood's attempt to translate invisible emotion into visible metaphor. It was the only language he had to describe feelings that society didn't yet have words for. Wood's own apartment inspired many of the interiors. The modest rooms, the wardrobe filled with Angora sweaters, the carefully arranged details all came directly from his life. They grounded the surreal story in something intimate and real. Friends who later watched the film recognized his belongings on screen and realized, often for the first time, that the project was more confession than fiction. Despite its uneven production, Glen or Glenda carried a sincerity that transcended its technical flaws. Each frame felt handmade, almost diary-like, revealing the vulnerabilities of a director trying to reconcile art and identity. While Glen or Glenda took inspiration from Christine Jorgensen's journey, it ultimately revealed far more about Ed Wood himself. By casting his own body in the central role, he placed his personal truth before the camera, a radical act for the era. In one of the film's most emotional moments, Glen confesses his secret to his fiancée. Instead of rejection, she offers understanding. The camera lingers on their hands as they clasp together, a silent promise that compassion can overcome fear. For Wood, this scene wasn't just storytelling, it was wish fulfillment, a glimpse of acceptance he rarely found in life. Throughout the film, the narration insists that people who express themselves differently are ordinary individuals with ordinary emotions. That simple declaration, so obvious today, was revolutionary in 1953. It challenged an entire culture built on conformity. Wood returned again and again to the image of Angora, the texture, the softness, the comfort. Viewers later mocked this obsession, but to him it symbolized warmth and safety, a gentle rebellion against a world that demanded rigidity. Within the weave of those sweaters, Wood found solace, and he wanted his audience to feel that same tenderness. At one point, the narrator intones, "He has fought against his inner self, the self that has cried out since childhood." Lines like these resonate beyond the film. They read as the director's own diary entries disguised as script notes. He was writing not only for his audience, but for himself, trying to articulate an internal battle that 1950s America had no vocabulary for. In many ways, Glen or Glenda stands as one of the earliest American films where the personal became inseparable from the political. By daring to show empathy toward experiences that mainstream society dismissed, Wood transformed his private struggle into a quiet act of cultural defiance. He never labeled himself, never joined movements, never spoke of activism, but his art did the speaking for him. Through sincerity alone, he opened a door for future storytellers to step through, decades before the world was ready to understand. When Glen or Glenda opened, moviegoers had no idea what they were walking into. Some expected an exposé, others a lurid exploitation film. What they saw instead was a strange, heartfelt plea for understanding wrapped inside an experimental fever dream. The confusion was immediate. Critics dismissed it as incompetent, audiences whispered nervously, and theater owners pulled it after brief runs. Yet the few who watched closely sensed something human underneath the chaos, a sincerity that couldn't be faked. Even in failure, the film carried a spark. For years, Glen or Glenda drifted in obscurity, circulating in bargain bin reels and midnight screenings. But in the 1960s and 70s, a new generation of film enthusiasts discovered it. To them, its awkward editing and surreal logic weren't flaws. They were signs of authenticity. College theaters and underground cinemas began programming it alongside other misunderstood classics. By the 1980s, scholars started reassessing Wood's work. Academic journals that once ignored low-budget cinema now examined it through the lens of cultural history. They argued that Glen or Glenda, despite its technical clumsiness, was among the first American films to treat questions of gender and identity with empathy. It became a case study in how sincerity can outlive ridicule. Then, in 1994, Tim Burton's biopic Ed Wood changed everything. Johnny Depp's portrayal reintroduced audiences to Wood not as a punchline, but as a dreamer chasing impossible visions. The movie framed Glen, or Glenda, as the beating heart of his career, a film made out of love, not exploitation. Suddenly, what had been mocked for decades was recognized as deeply human. Modern critics now see Glen or Glenda as a landmark of independent filmmaking. Its language is dated, its metaphors peculiar, but its message endures. In an era that punished difference, it whispered acceptance. It reminded viewers that compassion could exist even in the most unlikely corners of pop culture. Beyond film studies, Jorgensen's legacy and Wood's daring intersected in larger social change. Her public grace and his private honesty together formed an unspoken dialogue that helped nudge American awareness forward. When later movements demanded visibility, the groundwork, however accidental, had already been laid by figures like them. Time has softened the laughter that once greeted Glen or Glenda. What remains is a sense of wonder that such a movie existed at all in the buttoned-down 1950s. Long before mainstream cinema embraced personal storytelling, Ed Wood turned his vulnerabilities into art. His methods may have been chaotic, but his intentions were pure. Christine Jorgensen continued to live openly, performing around the world and writing her autobiography, proving that authenticity could coexist with dignity. She became a symbol of resilience in an age of repression. When she passed away in 1989, obituaries called her a pioneer, a description she had quietly earned decades earlier by simply being herself. Wood, meanwhile, struggled for recognition throughout his life. His later films rarely found audiences, and he died in relative obscurity. Yet history has been kinder to him than his contemporaries were. Today, film festivals celebrate his eccentric genius. Historians cite him as one of the first directors to merge personal confession with public cinema. Together, Jorgensen and Wood embody a curious symmetry. One transformed her life and faced the world with elegance. The other transformed his art and revealed his soul through celluloid. Each defied convention in their own way, and together they carved a tiny yet indelible space for honesty in an era built on denial. Looking back, Glen or Glenda feels less like a relic and more like a prophecy. Its clumsy montages and awkward narration anticipate later generations of filmmakers who used experimentation to tell personal stories. The film's flaws become part of its power. It refuses perfection because its subject, humanity itself, is imperfect. The black and white images flicker like fragments of a dream. Glen's uneasy smile, Glenda's serene expression, Lugosi's raised hand commanding, "Pull the strings." Each shot may be rough, yet together they form something oddly poetic, a plea for empathy masquerading as pulp cinema. It's impossible to watch the movie now without sensing Wood's vulnerability behind the lens. Every mismatched cut, every peculiar dissolve, feels like the heartbeat of someone trying to be understood. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing freedom. For audiences of the 1950s, that message was almost unthinkable. For audiences today, it feels timeless. We recognize in Wood's awkward sincerity the same desire that drives all artists, the hope that by revealing ourselves, we might find connection. As scholars revisit mid-century cinema, Glen or Glenda often appears in discussions about authenticity versus artifice. What makes it endure isn't its technique, but its emotional honesty. Viewers who approach it expecting parody often leave surprised by its tenderness. The movie's reevaluation mirrors society's broader journey toward understanding identity and self-expression. What was once taboo conversation is now mainstream discourse. In that shift, Wood's film, however accidental its influence, has become a historical marker, proof that empathy existed even in the margins of old Hollywood. Film historians note that the very existence of Glen or Glenda challenged censorship standards of the day. At a time when moral watchdogs dictated what could or couldn't appear on screen, Wood dared to discuss subjects that were considered untouchable. He did it not through shock, but through compassion. That quiet rebellion helped stretch the boundaries of what stories cinema was allowed to tell. Modern filmmakers cite Wood's fearless vulnerability as inspiration. Directors who blend autobiography with fantasy, whether in art house dramas or independent documentaries, owe a subtle debt to his example. His courage demonstrated that sincerity can survive ridicule, that telling one's truth is an act of creativity in itself. In the end, Glen or Glenda stands as both an artifact and anthem. It captures a moment when two worlds collided, the rigid expectations of the 1950s and the emerging understanding of personal authenticity. It's messy, uneven, and occasionally absurd, but its heart beats louder than its flaws. Ed Wood may not have realized it, but he created a time capsule of empathy. Beneath the camp and confusion lies a revolutionary idea that people deserve to live honestly, free from judgment. That message, whispered through grainy film stock, still echoes today. Christine Jorgensen's poise and Wood's eccentric bravery together tell a single story: the courage to be oneself. Their paths never truly crossed in life, yet through cinema, they remain forever intertwined. As the final reel of Glen or Glenda flickers out, we're left not with laughter, but reflection. In its imperfections, we see humanity, fragile, yearning, and endlessly seeking understanding. In a decade ruled by silence, Ed Wood dared to speak, and though his voice trembled, it carried across generations, reminding us that compassion, however clumsy its delivery, is the most radical act of all.